I use all good, modern, evangelical English Bible translations, but sometimes brothers in Christ I respect and love express some nervousness about my Bible translation prodigality. Some of them are, of course, King James onlyists, but not all of them are. Some of them simply lean toward the view that formal or literal translations, such as the New American Standard Bible or King James or New King James or ESV, are the only kinds of translations that are legitimate and useful. They all say to me, accuracy trumps readability. I want to evaluate this principle, answer a cogent commenter, explain an obscure verse in Proverbs, and, surprise, promote the use of multiple English Bible translations, all in one video. Also, today only, stick around to the end, and an angel will get its wings clipped. I totally get the appeal of this argument, this principle, accuracy trumps readability. Who wants to read a Bible that's been dumbed down for them? Who wants to miss things that God is saying just because some translator somewhere felt we wouldn't get it? But I see a false dichotomy threatening us here, and I've talked about this before. The only way an accurate translation of the Bible will ever be unreadable is if the inspired original is unreadable. If indeed a given passage is unreadable, then the most accurate translation of it will also be unreadable. Somehow, I don't think that those who defend the King James Version because accuracy trumps readability believe that God inspired unreadable words. When God inspired the word for broom in Isaiah 14:23, I feel safe in saying that he chose the common Hebrew word for broom at that time and not an archaic Hebrew word for broom that hardly anybody knew, like the King James's besom is for us today. And I want to say more about this principle. I've got to point out something that all skilled translators say, that all skilled translations demonstrate, something I'm afraid I don't hear from brothers who are promoting this principle. It's this: all translation requires minor compromises, and God set it up this way. You can never bring over every last tiny piece of information from one language as you translate it into another. God, at Babel, could have made it so that all languages have the same grammar and syntax, the same verb systems and grammatical gender systems, the same word order requirements, the same rhyming schemes, the same pronouns, just different words, different sounds. Then it would be a reasonably simple matter to replace one word with its equivalent in another. To translate English to Spanish, you just replace tree with Adu-Boahen and call it a dia. In this case, every translator would be an expert, and every translation would be perfect. Also, in this perfect world, it would never be windy on Tuesday nights when I play Ultimate Frisbee, and my 6-year-old would know without having to be reminded that stuff in the corners of his room needs to be cleaned up and not just the stuff in the center. I get lots of 30,000-foot principles from commenters, and again, not just from those who defend the King James/TR. I admit that I state some of these myself, like edification requires intelligibility. It's not bad to talk at the level of general principle. We all have to do it. But we also have to be able to bring things down to the level of the concrete. The principles have to work, or they aren't legitimate. It's a temptation and a danger for principled people to take good principles and ride them high into the clouds until they lose sight of those tiny details far below on the ground. It's a particular danger for people who don't know Hebrew and Greek to do this, because they cannot look at those details even if they want to. This is the thing I try to avoid saying, the thing I don't like saying, the thing it's hard to say without sounding arrogant and elitist, like some nasty redheaded YouTuber who edits a magazine about Bible study or something. So let me say it harder. I've translated all kinds of Bible verses and phrases, and accuracy trumps readability isn't a usable principle. It has the word trump in it for one thing, which is divisive. Anyway, more importantly, it doesn't work. When you try to land that plane, it crashes and burns. When you actually have a Greek text sitting in front of you and you actually have to translate it for actual people, you discover quickly that accuracy and readability work in constant interplay. You're standing in between them and trying to hold on to both of them. One or both of them might be trying to get away from you as you work on any given sentence. If it were really possible to have one principle to rule them all, namely accuracy trumps readability, then you'd think someone would have accomplished it by now. But even the King James translators did not accomplish this, and they didn't try. There are famous instances of functional translation in it. God forbid, God save the king. That's not what the Greek and Hebrew say. Let me end with one example out of several that were actually provided by a commenter. His name is Tulip Preservation. I'm going to presume it's a man because the overwhelming majority of my viewers, up in the 96th percentile or so, are men. He's some variety of King James only, I think, maybe TR only. But he asked a really fair question. Basically, he asked, how is it possible that the New King James Version takes some verses in Proverbs so differently from the King James? Surely the New King James translators were monkeying with the text somehow, right? What I really liked about this commenter is that he gave 6 concrete examples that had the feel to me of coming from his own study and not some list he found on the internet somewhere. I have chosen one of his examples at random by use of a hamster and a spinning prize wheel that I keep for this purpose. It's number 3 on his list, Proverbs 16:10. Here it is in the King James Version. A divine sentence is on the lips of the king. His mouth transgresseth not in judgment. Here it is in the New King James. Divination is on the lips of the king. His mouth must not transgress in judgment. The narrative that our King James only brothers bring to this passage usually, I find, goes something like this. The King James was perfectly fine before people realized they could make some money off of new Bibles, and so they changed these Bibles willy-nilly to help them avoid copyright problems and to make a lot of money. Usually our King James only brothers are fuzzy on the details. How exactly does Proverbs 16:10 help the New King James's owners to make more money? What doctrine is it undermining? There are at least 2 significant differences here. Where the King James has divine sentence, the New King James has divination. And since divination is usually considered sinful in the Old Testament, as I myself consider it, and since this passage appears to be praising divination in the New King James Version, this is indeed a worthy passage to examine. Were the New King James Version translators promoting witchcraft? Our King James only brothers, I can tell you, would in no wise put it past them. The second difference is in the final clause, which is either declarative, as in the King James, or imperative, as in the New King James Version. Either the king's mouth does not transgress in judgment, or it must not. Let's look at the key Hebrew words here. Maybe I'll use the Logos exegetical guide. Let's see if accuracy trumps readability works as a principle in this passage. Meanwhile, we'll discover the meaning of a somewhat obscure proverb. The first word is kesem in Hebrew. The King James translates this one Hebrew word as 3 English words, a divine sentence. I think this is the sense of sentence that we hear in courtroom settings. We don't hear of kings delivering sentences anymore because we don't have kings. But I think this is the sense here drawn from the Oxford English Dictionary. An opinion pronounced by a person on some particular question, usually one on which he is consulted or which is being deliberated upon. So in the KJV, we have an authoritative divine pronouncement, basically, on the lips of the king. In the New King James, we have divination, which, if you are charitable, is very similar to authoritative divine pronouncement. It just has an extra note in it, usually a bad one. A divine pronouncement that you're not supposed to give if you follow Yahweh. Divination is, again, usually a bad thing. People seek oracles, another possible translation of kesem, when they won't listen to the Lord. But the King James translators translate kesem as divination 9 out of its 11 occurrences, and they translate it as witchcraft in another. This is the only time they translate it as divine sentence. Perhaps indeed they felt uncomfortable saying that kings do or even perhaps should use divination, so they went with a milder alternative. This is totally okay for translators to do, if they think the Hebrew or Greek warrants it. The KJV translators went away here from the Bishop's Bible, the text they were revising. It says, "When the prophecy is in the lips of the king, his mouth shall not go wrong in judgment." This is the easiest rendering to understand from our theological perspective among those I've mentioned. They limit the statement to those times when the king prophesies, which is presumably not at all times, like when he's speaking ex cathedra, as it were. But there's no justification for this in the Hebrew that I can see. It just says, kesem is on the lips of the king. The standard Hebrew dictionaries give prediction, survey of future events, divination, and oracle as possible translations of this word kesem. We call these glosses. So which choice is accurate? I think that depends on how you interpret this phrase. Does it mean that anytime the king talks, God is talking? Does it mean that God stands behind whatever decision the king makes? The meaning, as in many of the Proverbs, is a bit obscure. It requires reflection, because the value of the Proverbs, their brevity, also makes interpretation sometimes difficult. Makes you kind of wish you had a king around who could make a divine authoritative pronouncement on the meaning of this phrase. Here's my favorite Proverbs commentator, Bruce Waltke, in the highly regarded New International Commentary on the Old Testament set, which I paid a great sum to acquire. He says, in this proverb, the Lord enacts divine justice through inspiring his wise king to give infallible verdicts that do not betray justice. If pagan kings had the competence to give justice, how much more the anointed of Israel? An inspired verdict elsewhere refers disparagingly to prescribed pagan divination and false prophecy. He's talking here about kesem. Yet here, and I'm still quoting, to judge from its immediate parallel justice and the broader context of this ideal king, he's talking about other verses in Proverbs nearby, it denotes a legitimate method of reaching a verdict in legal dispute. Divination is the art of discerning the mind of the deity to do the right thing at a particular time and in a particular situation. In that light, kesem is probably used here metaphorically to strikingly denote the spirit's gifting of the king to reach a swift and correct verdict. My other favorite commentator on Proverbs, Derek Kidner, may be closer to the mark, however, when he says that divination is an expression for the finality with which this man speaks. Kidner reads this verse as a reminder to the king, in a sense, that he speaks with a kind of divine authority, the kind that Romans 13 gives to governmental leaders. But as with Paul in Romans, Solomon is under no illusion that kings always do right, that they always say the right thing. Kidner says the Old Testament lends no support to the idea that the king can do no wrong. Rather, he is a man under authority. That, Kidner says, is what Proverbs 16:10 is saying. It seems to me, too, that this is what the King James translators were probably trying to get at. But so were the New King James translators. I'm not really sure they differed here in this first phrase in the final analysis. I just think the New King James rendering is more striking, and it is, strictly speaking, more literal, and in that sense more accurate, because this word elsewhere, kesem, is almost always translated divination. The same people who say that translation should be accurate rather than readable also say that translations shouldn't interpret. But the translator just has to interpret here. What in the world can it mean for Solomon to praise divination? He has to be using some kind of literary device. But what is his point? Whether you go with divine sentence or divination or oracle or prediction, you're going to be giving a little shade of meaning that may or may not have been intended by Solomon and by the Spirit. And without the Spirit nudging you one way or the other, you're just going to have to do your homework and do your best. Now to the second half of the verse. Is this a statement or a command? Is Solomon saying that kings don't transgress when dispensing justice, or that they shouldn't? I don't have the command of Hebrew that a native speaker would have, but the way I read this, it reads most naturally as a statement. The king's mouth does not transgress. Thus far, I'm with the King James translators here. As Waltke says, in short, the proverb presents the ideal king and anticipates the Messiah. So where do the New King James translators get their imperative idea, must not transgress? I think they're getting it from the overall sense of the verse, which is describing an ideal for kings to live up to, and is not providing a description of how they all actually operate. Solomon knew only too well that kings were not perfect. The Old Testament most certainly does not treat all kings as unerring in judgment. Multiple different translations made by educated, theologically conservative people go with the New King James here, and I could be wrong. But I'm with the UBS Translator's Handbook in saying that such a translation perhaps reflects more the opinion of the translators about present-day rulers than what the writer of these sayings intended. So, I'm actually with the King James translators against the New King James translators here in the second half of the verse. But I totally see why they did what they did. The King James translators themselves did this sort of thing too. They did it in the first half of the verse. You can't avoid it. It's not possible to translate without interpreting. In a sense, the King James translators soften the first half of the verse, and the New King James translators soften the latter half. I didn't plan this out, I promise, but it's the ESV that gets this the most right in my judgment. That just gives us what the text says in the most accurate way. An oracle is on the lips of a king. His mouth does not sin in judgment. But I can see why translators balk at this too. It sounds too blunt, too manifestly wrong, given what the Old Testament itself says about the sins of kings. To translate this literally means to put some extra burden on the reader. Maybe that's okay, maybe not, depending on the purposes of your translation. All told, if I get only one choice, I'm with the NKJV in the first half of the verse because I think it's helpful to use the same striking metaphor that Solomon used. He used the word for divination, kesem. I'd stick with it and leave the interpreting to the reader. All told, if I get only one choice, I'm with the King James in the latter half of the verse, because I think it's helpful to be as blunt as Solomon was, and again, leave interpretation to the reader. But if translators do a tiny bit of interpreting here, it's because translating is just not as simple as the accuracy trumps readability crowd imagines that it is. And if I'm allowed more than one English Bible on the desert island with me, and due to a small spelling error on the part of the King's Chamberlain, I was sent to Desert Island instead anyway, where we're allowed countless Bibles, then the presence of this little variation will alert me to some questions I should be asking. What does it mean for an oracle to be on the lips of a king? What does it mean to say so bluntly that he does not err in judgment? In the end, I look to the context of this verse, primarily the genre of the Proverbs themselves. They frequently describe ideals, generalities, general rules, to which Ecclesiastes will give the exceptions. At random, I selected another proverb that deals with kings, Proverbs 14:35. A servant who deals wisely has the king's favor, but his wrath falls on one who acts shamefully. But think of all the worm tongues you've known in politics and in the history of nations. Do wise servants always get the king's favor? No. Sometimes righteous servants who don't tell the king what he wants to hear get the axe, quite literally. Does the king's wrath always fall on those who act shamefully? No. This is the ideal, the thing that is generally true, but sometimes the king's wrath falls on the good guy. As many have pointed out, the Proverbs themselves acknowledge their genre. That is, you have Proverbs 26:4 and 5 apparently contradicting one another. One says to answer a fool, the other not to. Which is right? Both are. The Proverbs themselves require wisdom to use. So I do see Proverbs 16:10 as an ideal. Kings ought to speak wisdom as if they had a hotline to heaven. Kings' mouths ought not transgress God's laws while issuing judgments. I'm willing then to call the King James and New King James renderings both accurate. Both made a good faith attempt to communicate the meaning of the Hebrew to English speakers. I call the New King James a bit more readable because divine sentence seems a bit more obscure to me than divination. But again, I see why the King James translators did what they did. Translators always interpret. And it just doesn't work to tell them, stop interpreting and just be accurate. Accuracy trumps readability. I just don't think that principle works here. And as a pretty experienced translator who has worked in both Testaments and in the modern languages of Spanish and English, I'd like to plead for a little space for translators to do their best without essentially political pressure from people who've never translated a single divine sentence.